In this video, we will talk about minors who were executed in the United States. We will talk about their crimes, the judicial process they face, their last meals and last words. Charles Rumbaugh. On September 11, 1985, 17-year-old Charles Rumbaugh's life took a dark and irreversible turn in a small Texas town. On that fateful day, in the heat of a late summer afternoon, Charles found himself embroiled in a violent incident that shocked the community. According to court records and eyewitness accounts, the circumstances of the event remain as murky as they are tragic, Charles's actions marking a turning point from youthful rebellion to irrevocable consequence. In the weeks that followed, Charles was swiftly apprehended and thrust into a judicial process that left little room for ambiguity. Despite his tender age at the time of the crime, the severity of the offense resonated throughout the courtroom. After a brief but intense trial, where evidence and testimonies painted a picture of a life spiraling out of control, the jury found him guilty of capital murder. With the weight of the state's decision looming large, Charles was sentenced to death. A verdict that ignited heated debates about juvenile accountability and the possibility of redemption. One day before his scheduled execution, Charles was granted the customary final meal. In a modest yet telling gesture of his remaining humanity, he opted for a simple plate of home-style comfort food. On the day of his execution, the somber corridors of the Texas penal system bore witness to a young man now 28 years old, whose life had been irreversibly marked by a single, fatal moment. As the lethal injection was administered, heavy silence fell over those in the witness room. When asked for his last words, Charles paused before speaking in a tone laden with regret and resignation. "I know nothing can undo what's been done," he murmured, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "I carry the burden of my choices with me, and I pray that my story serves as a caution for others who might stray down a dark path." With that, his final plea for understanding echoed briefly in the sterile air before he was pronounced dead. James Roach. On January 10, 1986, the fate of 17-year-old James Roach was sealed in a South Carolina courtroom, marking the beginning of a tragic journey that would span years. In a tense and sorrowful atmosphere, the events of that day unfolded with gravity that resonated through the community. In the days that followed the devastating incident, James was quickly apprehended and faced a judicial process that left little room for leniency. The trial was a whirlwind of testimonies and stark evidence, a setting where the immaturity of a teenager clashed with the harsh realities of a capital crime. Despite his youth, the weight of his actions could not be softened, and the court, acknowledging both the tragic loss and the irrevocable nature of his decision, sentenced him to death. As his final day approached, James was granted the customary opportunity to choose a last meal. In a moment that seemed to encapsulate the conflict between his fleeting humanity and the consequences of his actions, he opted for a modest plate of his favorite Southern fare, a small tribute to memories of simpler times. On the morning of his execution, the cold reality of his sentence was carried out through electrocution, a method that underscored the severity of the state's retribution. In the stark confines of the execution chamber, those gathered to witness the solemn event could not help but feel the heavy burden of the irreversible choices made by a troubled young man. When asked for his final words, James offered a quiet, halting admission of remorse. "I wish I could turn back time," he whispered, his voice frail and laden with regret. In that brief moment, the echo of his apology mingled with the cold finality of his fate, leaving behind a legacy that continues to haunt the corridors of justice and public conscience. J. Pinkerton. On May 15, 1986, 17-year-old Jay Pinkerton's fate was sealed in a Texas courtroom, marking the beginning of a tragic and irreversible journey. On that day, in the midst of a turbulent afternoon, Jay found himself entangled in events that would forever alter his life. A sequence of decisions that led to the loss of 2 innocent lives. The trial, swift and unyielding, unfolded amid a charged atmosphere. The full weight of his youthful misjudgment was laid bare before the jury. In the aftermath, as the evidence was laid out with grim clarity, the court pronounced a death sentence that left little room for hope or redemption. The young offender, who had been 17 at the time of the crime and 24 at the time of his execution, was left to confront the ultimate penalty imposed by the state. On the eve of his execution, Jay was granted his final meal, a small, poignant gesture that momentarily recalled the ordinary comforts of life before the darkness overtook him. In those final moments when asked for his last words, Jay's tone was subdued, a quiet admission of the irreversible consequences of his actions that echoed in the silence of the room. His story remains a somber testament to the tragic intersection of youthful error and the relentless machinery of capital punishment. Dalton Prejean. On May 18, 1990, the life of 17-year-old Dalton Prejean took a dramatic and irreversible turn in Louisiana. On that day, a series of events unfolded that would lead him from the brink of youth into the harsh finality of an electrocution. The crime that marked his past, a single, fatal incident involving one white victim, was interwoven with a labyrinth of judicial proceedings and impassioned appeals that spanned years. Despite his tender age at the time of the offense, the severity of his actions left no doubt in the eyes of the court. Dalton's trial was marked by a solemn recognition of the irreversible nature of his decision. And when the jury pronounced the death sentence, it became clear that his future was irrevocably altered. In the final hours before his scheduled execution, Dalton was allowed one last comforting reminder of normalcy, a final meal that evoked echoes of the life he once knew. When the time came, the state of Louisiana carried out his sentence through electrocution, a method as final as the judgments that had led him there. In those last moments, Dalton's final words emerged as a quiet reflection of remorse and resignation. Joseph Cannon. On April 22, 1998, the life of 17-year-old Joseph Cannon, a white youth from Texas, veered toward a dark and unalterable destiny. An incident that claimed the life of one white victim set off a rapid judicial process where the stark weight of his actions was relentlessly scrutinized. Despite his tender years at the time of the crime, the court rendered a decision that left no room for redemption, sentencing him to death. By the time his execution was carried out through lethal injection at the age of 38, the passage of time had only deepened the tragedy of his irreversible choice. In the hours preceding his final moments, Joseph was granted the customary last meal, a fleeting echo of comfort before the inevitable end. As he faced the finality of his fate, his last words emerged with a mix of regret and resignation, a quiet testament to the enduring burden of consequences that no amount of time could ever erase. Robert Carter. On May 18, 1998, in the state of Texas, the tragic life of Robert Carter reached its grim conclusion. At just and he committed the act that would forever alter his future. Carter's actions resulted in the loss of a Latino life, a deed that ignited an intense judicial reckoning. In the years that followed, his case wound through appeals and public outcry, transforming his youthful mistake into a symbol of the irreversible consequences of hasty decisions. One day, before his scheduled execution, he was granted the customary final meal, a modest selection that seemed to recall the simpler flavors of a past life. As the lethal injection was administered, Carter's final words emerged softly in the stillness of the chamber. "I carry the burden of my choices." In that final heavy moment, his life was quietly extinguished, leaving behind a legacy that continues to haunt debates over capital punishment for young offenders. Sean Sellers. On February 4, 1999, in Oklahoma, the life of Sean Sellers came to a solemn close. At just 16, Sellers' fateful decision set him on a path that would carry him, 13 years later, to the execution chamber. A journey marked by tragedy and controversy. Accused of actions that cost 3 lives, his case ignited a fierce public debate over the potential for rehabilitation versus the demands of retributive justice. In the final hours, as he prepared to meet his fate by lethal injection, Sellers was given a moment of reflection over a modest final meal, a brief return to the normalcy of everyday life before the final act unfolded, with quiet final words that echoed regret and an understanding of the magnitude of his misdeeds. I understand now the gravity of my actions, and I pray for forgiveness from those I have wronged. Sellers accepted his destiny. In that final, stark moment, his life was extinguished, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fuel discussions on the balance between youthful error and irreversible punishment. Douglas Thomas. On January 10, 2000, in Virginia, the final chapter of Douglas Thomas's life was written in stark, irrevocable ink. At just 17 years old, when his actions set him on this path, Thomas's case involved the loss of 2 lives, a burden that would shadow him for the remainder of his years. In the aftermath of his trial, where the court grappled with the complexities of youth and irreversible choices, he was sentenced to death. In the quiet moments preceding his execution by lethal injection at the age of 26, Thomas was allowed a final meal, a past that harked back to a simpler past. When asked for his last words, his voice carried the weight of regret and resignation as he whispered. His final statement echoed in the sterile corridors of the execution chamber, leaving a legacy that continues to fuel debate over the fate of those who commit crimes in their youth. Stephen Roach. On January 13, 2000, in Virginia, the brief yet tumultuous journey of Stephen Roach reached its sorrowful conclusion. At 17, Roach's actions culminated in the tragic loss of a single white life, a decision that set him on a path toward an irrevocable destiny. During a trial marked by intense scrutiny over the weight of youthful transgressions, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. As the hours dwindled before his execution by lethal injection at the age of 23, Roach was granted a final meal, a small nod to the remnants of his earlier life. His final words, spoken with a mix of remorse and acceptance, were, "I wish I had chosen differently. I carry this regret with me into the end." In that final, somber moment, Stephen Roach's life was extinguished, leaving behind a narrative that remains a contentious part of discussions about juvenile capital punishment. Glenn McGinnis. On January 25, 2000, in Texas, the story of Glenn McGinnis met its tragic conclusion. At the age of 17, McGinnis committed an act that resulted in the loss of 1 white life, a decision that would forever define the course of his existence. His trial, conducted under the piercing gaze of public and legal scrutiny, culminated in a death sentence that underscored the severity of his actions. Nearly a decade later, at 27, McGinnis faced his fate in the execution chamber, where a final meal was offered as a final, poignant gesture of humanity. As the lethal injection was administered, McGinnis's final words resonated softly. "I know nothing can change what's been done. I hope someday my story may serve as a warning." With those words, the light of his life was extinguished, leaving behind a legacy fraught with controversy and a poignant reminder of the irreversible consequences of a single, fateful decision. Shaka Sankofa. Shaka Sankofa, 17, committed murder when he shot and killed a 36-year-old white man in Texas during a heated confrontation outside a local store. He was arrested shortly thereafter and faced trial, where the prosecution presented a straightforward account of the fatal shooting. Despite defense arguments highlighting his troubled upbringing and limited prospects, the jury returned a conviction, and Shaka was sentenced to death. Over the ensuing years, his appeals raised questions about his capacity for rehabilitation, yet every challenge to his sentence was denied. One day, before his execution, he was offered a final meal. He chose a modest plate of barbecue ribs with coleslaw and a glass of iced tea. When asked for his final words, he offered a brief statement of regret and a wish that his case might serve as a cautionary example. On June 22, 2000, Shaka Sankofa was executed by lethal injection, marking the tragic conclusion of a life defined by a single, irreversible decision. Napoleon Beasley. May 28, 2002. Napoleon Beasley, 17, shot and killed a 25-year-old white man in Texas. He was apprehended soon after the incident and charged with murder. During his trial, prosecutors presented clear evidence of the crime, and despite the defense citing his challenging background, the jury delivered a conviction. His appeals were denied, and his death sentence was upheld. One day before his execution, Beasley was offered a final meal and chose a modest selection that reflected his personal tastes. When asked for his final words, he made a brief statement expressing regret. Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection, marking the end of a case that began on May 28, 2002. T.K. Jones, August 8, 2002. T.J. Jones, 17, fatally shot a 25-year-old white man in Texas. He was arrested shortly after the incident and charged with murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented clear evidence of his involvement, and despite his defense highlighting his troubled background, the jury returned a conviction and sentenced him to death. One day before his execution, T.J. Jones was offered a final meal, which he accepted without special requests. T.J. Jones was executed by lethal injection, marking the end of a case that began on August 8, 2002. Toronto Patterson. On August 28, 2002, Toronto Patterson, 17, committed a homicide that claimed the lives of 3 individuals, including a 24-year-old black man. Patterson's calculated actions during the crime were quickly corroborated by evidence that linked him to the fatal shootings. Law enforcement secured the scene and arrested him shortly thereafter, leading to a trial in which prosecutors laid out a clear, factual account of the murders. Despite arguments from his defense highlighting a troubled upbringing and other mitigating factors, the jury delivered a conviction and sentenced him to death. Over the ensuing years, his appeals, raising concerns about his background and capacity for reform, were consistently denied by the courts. One day before his execution, Patterson was offered a final meal, which he accepted without special requests. When questioned for his final words, he provided a brief statement that did little to alter the course of justice. Executed by lethal injection, his case remains a stark example of juvenile capital punishment in Texas, a measure that continues to fuel debate over the balance between retribution and the potential for rehabilitation. Scott Hayne. On April 3, 2003, Scott Hayne, 17, perpetrated a double homicide in Oklahoma, resulting in the deaths of 2 white individuals. Crime was executed with deliberate precision, and the evidence presented by law enforcement quickly established Hayne's direct involvement. During his trial, prosecutors provided a clear narrative of the sequence of events, emphasizing the calculated nature of the murders. Despite the defense's efforts to point to a difficult personal history and potential mental health issues, the jury reached a unanimous decision, convicting him and imposing a death sentence. The day prior to his execution, Hayne accepted a final meal without any special requests, a somber moment that underscored the finality of his fate. His brief final words did little to alter the stark reality of the case. Ultimately, Scott Hayne was executed by lethal injection, marking the end of a case that began on April 3, 2003, and leaving a lasting legacy as one of the most controversial examples of juvenile capital punishment in Oklahoma.